Hello, hi. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katrina, and I am the coordinator for the APPG for Entrepreneurship. The APPG was set up to bring parliamentarians and the business community together to encourage, support, and promote entrepreneurship. And we are delighted to be bringing you today's webinar, where we will be discussing the economy, technology, and bouncing back after lockdown. There's been a huge amount of speculation about what the new normal will be looking like after we leave this the current situation, and how emerging technologies will change our business practices, and what impact the government's exit strategy is going to have on tax. So this webinar is coming at the perfect time, and we're really pleased to be joined by an expert panel today. So our first speaker is John Penrose, who is the Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare, and he's formerly served in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport as Lord Commissioner of Her Majesty's Treasury and a Minister of State for Northern Ireland. And prior to entering Parliament, ran a number of small technology companies. So John, thank you very much for joining us. We're also joined by Baroness Kramer, a Liberal Democrat peer in the House of Lords. She is the party's Treasury spokesperson, and she was a former Transport Minister and MP for Richmond Park. And prior to her political career, Baroness Kramer co-founded a financial consultancy company specializing in infrastructure. And finally, to give us the corporate perspective, we're joined by Gary Richards, a corporate tax partner from Mishcon de Reya, and Gary has assisted the government in a range of tax reforms, so his insights into the current upheaval are very welcome. So in terms of running order, our speakers will share their thoughts first, and then we'll move into Q&As. Everyone is welcome to put in their questions themselves. What we're asking people to do is write their questions in the chat box. You can share your thoughts throughout the meeting. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask one of our speakers, please write it into the chat box and write who the question would be directed to, and we'll let you know if we're going to come to you so you can kind of prepare for a moment before we start. And after the meeting, if you've got any additional questions, if we don't make it to anybody, we will pass them on to our speakers. So without any further ado, I think we're going to start with John Penrose. John, go ahead.
Am I now unmuted? I'm now unmuted, yep. Super.
Yes, you are.
Well, thank you ever so much, Katrina, and delighted to be here. You mentioned in your introductory remarks that no one's really sure what the new normal is going to be like, but we're all pretty sure that the world is changing around us as a result of the lockdown. And in fact, the fact that we're all here on this Zoom call, I suspect that if you went back 3 months, a large proportion of the people on this call had never heard of Zoom before the lockdown began. So we are already behaving in an enormously different way. We can know that, we can feel it, we can see it. And the question is how much of that's going to stick once we start to emerge from lockdown and it is progressively withdrawn. Hard to work out precisely, and you know, if any of us knew exactly, then we'd all get very rich by investing incredibly brilliantly in whichever technologies and firms are going to do best out of it. But I think some directional trends are probably becoming fairly obvious to most of us by now. So, for example, the new normal, I think, is going to involve things like the level of business travel, I think, is going to be permanently reduced, just because things like this allow an awful lot more meetings to take place that we discovered don't have to be done face-to-face, although I don't expect that all face-to-face meetings will evaporate entirely at all. So it'll be permanently reduced, but it will still be there, I suspect. Ditto foreign travel. I think that the level of business foreign travel will again be hit, although once the lockdown is over, it'll be interesting to see what happens to leisure travel. So hard to ponder how that's going to work. Much will, I think, depend on the supply side there about how many airlines remain solvent and operating in 18 months' time, but that's a separate question. Ditto on commuting. Different format, obviously, of business travel, but I don't think anybody is shedding any tears for the lack of the commute in their life. And what I think we've all learned is that there's a great deal we can do remotely, there's a great deal we can do digitally. And I think most people will want to do that, partly because it's just a great deal more pleasant, and also because until we have an effective treatment or a vaccine for the virus, public transport is just a bit more risky than most of us would want it to be. But also because it's just a great deal more productive. If your commute is walking downstairs rather than an hour and a half door to door to get into the City of London or wherever it might be, an awful lot of people will say, well, look, I can get an awful lot more done, and you gain time in the day. What that does mean, of course, is that the new normal, I think, is going to involve a vast increase in digital bandwidth. This is something which has been growing anyway, demand for digital bandwidth, I mean. This is something which has been growing steadily anyway, but I think that what the lockdown has done is it's moved all those trends which were already established and has shunted them forward at a much faster rate than anyone was expecting. So probably those are now 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, choose your number, further ahead of where everyone expected them to be by now, because of the effect of the lockdown before, because we've had a forced acceleration as a result of this. And then, of course, there are all the other trends which were already underway, things like the drive to get to net zero on environmental concerns, things like that, which I don't think have been changed at all, and in some cases may have been accelerated. For example, I think that, again, the fact that people can hear nature because there aren't so many cars around has probably made environmental concerns, brought them home to people. But I think that an awful lot of those concerns are still there. I don't think they have been changed. I think they will continue to grow. So what does all that mean? It means that we're going to end up with a new normal. I think we can all see the overall shape of it. But if you wanted to invest on the back of that overall shape, I think you'd need a great deal more detail and a great deal more texture to it in order to understand exactly how this is going to play through. But I think any of us who is expecting things to go back to pretty much the way they were before, we'd be living in cloud cuckoo land if we thought that that was the case. We know it's going to be different. The question is how, not if. What does that mean for things like the fourth industrial revolution? Well, I suspect that what it probably means is that the pattern of demand for some of the products that are being developed as part of the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, call it what you will have been accelerated, and that therefore some of those business plans that were being considered, which were already probably moving quite fast because everyone was trying to do things in internet time, I think we've now got to coin a new phrase, which is coronavirus time or COVID time. What's happened in this lockdown is that some things have been pushed even faster than they were having to move before. And some of them have been pushed up, some of them pushed down. I wouldn't, for example, be very comfortable if I was involved in the corporate real estate market. I think that the demand for example, for office space may very well be negatively affected by the level of people working from home in future. So some things will be depressed, but other things, particularly to do with the new technologies, are likely to be shoved forward faster than anyone had dreamed possible. And therefore, some of the things which people thought, well, I reckon the world will be ready for that in a year, the world may be ready for it now because of the changes that has happened. Final thought, before I hand over to the other speakers, the question about what this means for the government's finances and for the tax system, I think is fraught. It is a very important question, and the answers are fraught with risks. And the reason why is because what we know so far is that both we have plunged ourselves for understandable and I think good reasons into what I hope will be a very temporary but very profound recession. And that's going to mean that an awful lot of things that worked before, both from the government's point of view in terms of balancing the nation's the public finances, but also from businesses' point of view, just won't work anymore. And so the scale of potential layoffs, which nobody wants but everybody fears, later on as we start to emerge out of lockdown and as things like some of the government programs on supporting self-employed and supporting furloughed workers, as those are wound down, we will then see just exactly how many jobs are no longer supportable at whatever the new, probably lower initial levels of demand are. And I think that's going to be extremely painful. It's going to be painful obviously for the people involved. There's going to be, as I said, job losses, and it's going to be difficult all round. But it's also going to be difficult for Rishi Sunak at the Treasury, because his tax receipts are going to be lower. No one knows quite how much, but they're certainly going to be lower. We already know that the state of the government's balance sheet, the level of public borrowings, is huge. I think I'm right in saying, but someone I'm sure will correct me, that the monthly borrowings for the month of April were the highest ever. As in our entire country's entire history, April was the most amount of money we'd ever borrowed in 1 month, full stop. That just shows you the effect on our existing balance sheet. And that's on a balance sheet which was only partly recovered in the wake of the 2008 banking crisis in any case. So we were starting from a relatively high level of public debt compared to the size of our economy. That public debt is now ramping up at an extraordinarily fast rate. And of course, the economy is going to be slower, going to be smaller. And so therefore, the pressures on the Treasury are going to be enormous. I think that means a couple of things. Firstly, I hope that we will not yield to the understandable but dangerous temptation to push all the infrastructure spending across to the right, to postpone it, to delay it, because it allows us to free up more money to spend on current spending. The reason why I say that is because the infrastructure spending is essential for future growth. And actually, if we're going to grow our way out of this crisis and to push the level of economic growth up after this, which we're really going to need to do, given the effect of the recession that we're currently in, then postponing infrastructure will be, over the medium term, an incredibly short-sighted thing to do. But it's very, very politically difficult not to postpone it, because all the pressure, all the political pressure, comes on the current budget. It comes on the day-to-day spending. Understandably, it's a very human reaction, but it comes on, how can you possibly not spend as much on health? How can you possibly not spend as much on schools? How can you possibly not spend as much on police and on defence, etc., etc.? All those things still matter. And so the difficulty which Rishi will face is balancing the day-to-day spending and balancing the current budget based on the new normal, which will not be as good in terms of tax receipts, without yielding to the temptation of mortgaging the long-term economic success that will ultimately have to pay for the public services which we all want. The second thing I think which he will also have to do, therefore, is to address the overall shape of the taxation system. And the reason why I say that is because he's going to be under huge pressure from all the spending departments to raise taxes, because taxation levels will be low. They won't want to cut their budgets. The only way he's going to be able to do that in their minds is to raise taxes. He isn't going to want to do that. He is, after all, a conservative, and we believe in A, in fact, sound finances, and B, we believe, if we possibly can, in leaving as much money for people to spend for themselves rather than the government telling them how to do it. But he can't start borrowing just to fund the short-term current budget. That would break the golden rule. He would have to basically abandon large chunks of what the fiscal rules have been for a long time. And therefore, I think his only answer, or at least part of his answer, has to be to change the shape of the tax system. I think that will probably mean that he's going to have to simplify it in order to get rid of quite a lot of the existing special loopholes, special programs, special dispensations that have been given to this sector and that sector. And those have built up ever since Nigel Lawson was Chancellor, and we now have one of the most complicated, some would say baroque, taxation systems in the world. And what that means is that it's not a terribly efficient tax system either. And I think probably if he's going to raise any more money without raising headline rates, he's going to have to close some of those programs down in order to A, make the taxation system fairer on all concerned with a much sort of simpler, consistent level of tax, but also therefore that will allow him to raise a little bit more money without having to just raise the current headline rates of tax. It is a very difficult, extremely pressured situation he's going to find himself in. And I think, therefore, he's going to have to undertake some structural reforms. Katrina, I will leave everyone with two examples of the sorts of things that I have no idea if he will consider, But I and others might be suggesting he should. And one is that, for example, at the moment, if you look at the overall marginal effective rates of tax that are paid by the lowest paid in society compared to the better off, what we currently see is that if you add together the taxes, income taxes paid on investment income, plus the income taxes paid on earned income, plus the benefits withdrawal rates, which apply to people who are claiming benefits, i.e. at the lower end of the income scale. If you add all those things together, what you see is that the marginal rates of tax paid by the least well-off in total, if you add those three things together, are something like twice what is currently paid by the people at the higher end of the income scale, because people at the higher end of the income scale have more investment income. People at the lower income scale end have to repay clawback rates of benefits they're claiming. How can that be fair if we're all in this together? How can that be justified at all? So that creates both a political imperative to make the system fairer and to equalize those levels, and also to say, look, we don't think that the haves should be subsidized by the have-nots, and that may give him an opportunity to make some changes structurally. Equally, there's a we face in the field of corporate taxation an odd situation where the existing traditional, and this is not confined to the UK, the traditional way of incentivizing investment is to give people tax shelter on the interest that they pay on corporate borrowings. The aim originally behind it was to say, if you borrow to invest, then you should get a tax shelter on. Now, of course, at the moment, that is also a tax shelter which is used extensively by financial engineering. And what you could do as a very radical idea, but to give an example of the kind of scale of things that is possible, even though he may very well not want to do this, is you could, for example, turn around and say, we're going to change that. We're going to instead give people a tax shelter on when you spend the money on property, plant, equipment, digital development, research and development, and those sort of things. We're going to give you 100% of that money as a tax shelter in the year you spend it, but we're going to change and remove the taxation break on the corporate borrowing. It would be revolutionary to do that, but it would make some very, very profound changes to the way our economy runs, and particularly in terms of driving investment in the economy's long-term growth potential. Those are just two pretty radical examples of the kinds of things that are open to him, but given the strength of the pressures that I think he's going to be under, both financial and also fiscal and also political, I'm using them not because I think he's necessarily going to announce those tomorrow or anything like it, but just as an illustration of the kind of scale and degree of radicalism which I think we are going to have to look at in order to get through this in a sensible way. I will stop there. I hope I have scared everybody sufficiently.
John, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing such a comprehensive and well thought through perspective on the current situation and what's coming up ahead. We're going to move swiftly on to Baroness Kramer. So Baroness, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I found John's talk really fascinating and not conventionally conservative, which I think is exciting. Let me start with the silver lining, since we're talking to an audience that many of whom are involved in tech companies. I think one of the few silver linings I can find out of COVID-19 and lockdown is that there has just been the most extraordinary advance in the acceptance of new tech and also the use of technology, but just by a huge sweeping range of the population. And to me, that is an opportunity not to be wasted. And I hope it's something that we're going to lean into. It gives us the opportunity to, I think, to move much faster into the fourth industrial revolution and to look at tackling one of the absolute fundamental problems of the British economy, which is our incredibly poor productivity. And while tech isn't the only answer to that, it potentially is a major way to tackle that low productivity level. So if we don't deal with that, we're never going to get the kind of growth rates that we need for the kind of recovery and the kind of future that we want. I'm also struck very much by generational differences. The reaction to COVID. John basically said, you know, how many people don't, you know, would happily now give up their commute, will want to work remotely, perhaps buy a great deal more online, look to online solutions for the various ways in which they deal with issues in their lives. And I suspect that is basically going to be very much the over 40 generation. It'll include old folks like me, who are in our 70s, and who might not have been comfortable before. But many of us are now unwilling to give up, I think, some of the sort of de-stressing that has come, the ability to balance life in a different way. But when I talk to people in their 20s, boy, are they missing that sort of day-to-day contact, the energy and adrenaline of the office, the sort of blurring of being in the office and going off and socializing afterwards. And also the ability to learn and to accomplish more, which I think you do when you have that day-to-day contact and that kind of exchange. So I suspect we're moving to some sort of hybrid future. And quite what the shape of that is going to be, I'm not quite sure. But I do suspect, ironically, it's going to be generational in a way that we might not have anticipated, with a lot of the oldies keener on saying, now, how can I use technology to make my life simpler and more varied and to balance all my various interests and priorities? And younger people hankering more for the time when you knew you went into the office and you knew the folk who would be there, and you have that dynamic around you. So this, to me, is the time to invest for recovery. And I am concerned that we invest in the businesses of the future. There will be a certain instinct to prop up and save businesses and sectors that were already, frankly, in trouble and quite likely to fade. It's going to be quite tough, I think, for the government to resist that, so the demands to respond to those areas, because obviously, you know, if you were to get retail shops back up and running rapidly, those are immediate jobs. But if the long-term future is going to mean a very different profile for retail, should you really be putting your investment energy in recreating what we had in November 2019, or do you start to put it into the sort of into the opportunities that will underpin our future economy? And in a sense, I think the green agenda falls into that category as well. I mean, this is a real opportunity. None of us are commuting to try and do this now in a very different way. The question is, do we seize it, or do we try and go back and recreate what we had in 2019 and then worry about moving into the green economy at some point in the future? And I think that's going to be a very big decision for government to make, and not an easy one, because there will be a lot of pressures, as it were, to restore the past because it feels safe and people know where they are. Like John, I am very concerned about the fiscal position, but not just the fiscal position of the government. I think a lot of individuals are now loaded up with debt. They've either been on furlough, they've carried additional costs, their business has shrunk, they may be made redundant already. I think we'll see many more redundancies as the various support schemes taper off. And also, I've never bought the sort of Bank of England OBR profile that demand bounces back almost without a breath. That just doesn't square with what I see happening within my own community and the various businesses that I talk to. I think this is going to be hugely, hugely problematic. And at the moment, I think there's a sort of conventional wisdom. Interest rates are low, we can carry vast amounts of debt, it's not a problem. I'm afraid I'm a bit of a Cassandra on this one. I always worry. I know it's unfashionable and inconvenient, but I do think the potential for interest rates to turn back up, but always sits just outside the front door. We're in a different situation from the financial collapse in 2008 and 2009, because there our problems, we were the extreme. If you remember, at about 2010, now our fiscal situation was actually worse than Greece. We were at an extreme, and therefore, if the bond markets moved away from us, that was because we were an outlier. At the moment, you could say the whole globe is captured in this same set of problems. So maybe that gives us more flexibility and more time to try and repair the fiscal problems that we have. But I think they are real, and they're going to have to be faced. And what I think has become a conventional wisdom, which if we sort of borrow into eternity, so has a lot of question marks hanging around it. And it certainly means we would have no contingency at all for another crisis. And there is no law that says crises only come by ones. That's not the way fate and life tend to work. I think it's really important as we start to look at growing business in the future that instead of just focusing on borrowing, we now start looking at equity. And the government to some extent has started that with its future fund. I think the first few days' results, so some big take up. And my guess is that the venture capitalists are very happy with the shape of the future fund and the way that it's going. However, angel investors and individuals really can't use these schemes. Somehow the government is going to have to face up to the reality that EIS is going to need to be incorporated into either the future fund or into an equivalent program. If people argue that that's unfair because it's giving additional breaks to investors, it seems to me you claw that back through changes in the capital gains tax farther out. But you continue to use what have been the really successful programs to get people to invest, particularly in the new, particularly in startups. And of course, we've got to make sure that that expands into scale up. And again, when I hear people say, oh, but the EU won't let us, that's not stopping Macron. It takes some imagination and commitment. And to this point, I don't think the government's commitment has been there. I think it's been focused very much on the venture capital market. It hasn't been focused on the angel investors and individuals, and it needs to shift that very rapidly to make sure that we don't lose this great opportunity and actually lose many of the startups that are out there, because they're our future. I also think the government's going to have to change its attitude to the self-employed. We get high levels of unemployment. Then many people will start to look at self-employment as a route out. At the moment, frankly, universal credit wouldn't help you do that. But also, I think the way in which, for example, people who are directors of their own companies have been excluded, if you like, from most of the mechanisms to help the self-employed is the wrong message. It's been a bad decision to make, quite frankly. We need the kind of people who choose to work as self-employed contractors. The people who have that, within that group is embedded so much innovative skill. Sometimes I think self-employment gets tagged entirely with the abuses of the gig economy. Those I think have to be tackled. So we shouldn't allow that kind of abuse to continue. But there is a very significant sector of people who are driven and skilled and innovative and can provide the change that we need. They're never going to be suitable to be employed by a company. They are always going to be people who need to move from project to project. And at the moment, I think the government looks at them as if they're tax avoiders. At the time that all of that was dropped, people understand the risks, and it's time to go back and work out how we really manage to support that particular group. And if we don't, I think we will lose out greatly on opportunities. I'll just close talking just for a couple of moments about tax. Like John, I think this is going to be an opportunity to do something quite radical on the tax front. I'm quite clear when I look at the government's debt levels that they can't be dealt with by cutting public spending. We have cut public spending beyond the bone, and I do think that the public at large are now aware of that. Benefits, I mean, most people now using the benefit system for the first time, I think, are in a state of shock to realize how minimal the amount of money is, that people have to live on and try and manage their families on. And I can't see that there's room to cut any more within that area. I think, in fact, in both of those areas, there'll have to be improvements. And again, as John pointed out, the infrastructure gap, that's got to be filled. So we can't cut back on infrastructure projects. So we can't do all of that. If we're concerned about levels of borrowing, we're going to have to look to tax. And again, this is, I think, an unpopular subject at the moment, but we're going to have to face it. John is right. One of the things you could do, particularly if you want to drive people much more into equity and away from debt, is to look at to look at the way of the tax treatment of interest. Maybe you don't basically take, maybe you only allow companies to expense a portion of the interest, or in some ratio of it. You could look at a whole lot of different ways in which to do that. Part of the tech advance of the fourth industrial revolution is to remove national boundaries. Most of our tax systems are geared around the assumption that companies work essentially within a national boundary. Now, we're going to have to tackle that as we look at the big digital companies. Do we shift towards more sales-related taxes? All of those issues are going to be raised. You're hearing conversations about financial transaction taxes. If you expand that concept, we look at taxing transaction. There's another set of issues there. But I suspect one of the things we will see is a shift much more towards wealth taxes. They're some of the easiest taxes to collect. There is a sense that people who have high levels of wealth, on the whole, are much more lightly taxed than those who don't. And again, it's a very fraught area, but I think there's going to be a look at that range of issues.
Fantastic. Baroness Kramer, thank you so much, and for speaking so passionately on behalf of the many of us on this call who are part of that small business community, the entrepreneurs. Right, we're going to keep moving on swiftly, but can I just remind everybody that we will be taking questions from the audience. So you should be able to see a question, the chat box. If you go to the bottom of the screen and look at the kind of menu options, there's a box that says chat. And if you bring that up, that is the place to post your questions. So please ask anything you like, within reason, of course, and we'll pass those on to our speakers. And Philip Salter, the MD and founder of the Entrepreneurs Network, will be chairing those in a minute. Right, we're now going to come to Gary Richards, the corporate tax advisor from Mishcon de Reya, and he is going to share some of his views on the current situation. Gary, go ahead. Gary, we can't hear you. Okay, it looks like we're having a small technical issue. So what we're going to do is, Gary, we're going to come back to you in a moment. But in the meantime, Philip, if you could start asking just a few questions, that would be great.
Great. So as Katrina says, I'm the founder of the Entrepreneurs Network, and we're the Secretariat for the APPG for Entrepreneurship. So I'll start with some questions that have come through. And my job here is effectively to allow Katrina to kind of go to you guys and ask the questions. But because she's obviously dealing with this technical thing, I'll just pass them through. I'll kind of read them out for the moment until she's back online. So the first one is from Ilda, and it's around kind of getting highly skilled migrants into the country. So I guess that's obviously the immigration system, but also perhaps the tax system as well, and other things. We've certainly done some work on that. So I'll ask John and then Baroness Cramer if you have any thoughts on that and how the government should be kind of thinking about kind of attracting the kind of best and brightest, even with people kind of not travelling around too much at this time.
Am I now unmuted? I am now unmuted. Yeah, look, we have a huge advantage, and whatever your views may have been on Brexit, pro or anti, one of the things that leaving does do is it allows us to draw more easily and more evenly on the talents of anybody who's got skills, who's got ability, who's got drive, who's got passion and ambition from any country in the world. So to that extent, it is there's a potential, an opportunity there which will be easier to access in future. And the new immigration system needs to do that. That's its expressed aim. The bit which I think people are going to need some reassurance on, I hope we will be provided with this, and is what to do with the unskilled, need for unskilled or less skilled labour, because every economy needs a bit of that as well. And at the moment, that's one of the shortage areas which we have in Britain, at least. And so I think that there's a question mark around that. I don't think it's actually necessarily terribly relevant to today's audience. So I don't propose to dwell on it, but it is a question that does need to be properly answered. The point about it is, though, that if we get the immigration system right, then the best tech experts in whatever your chosen field may be, from any country in the world, from Russia to Brazil and anywhere else in between, should be available to you. Plus, of course, as both Susan and I were saying, given the fact that people can now work remotely, they may not actually need to relocate here completely, or even if only partly. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. But yes, immigration will be an essential part of driving our economy in future, clearly.
Yeah, I'm going to be far more concerned than John is about this. So the sort of notion that a visa isn't an issue, I think misses the point. So certainly now, if you're within the 27 countries of the European Union, there are 27 countries that can go and offer you work without you. Not only do you not need a visa, you don't have to think, what will I be doing in 2 or 3 years' time when my visa might be reviewed? I don't know if I can stay on. So your partner could be a wife, could be a husband, could be an unmarried partner. So will they be able to work? Most families now are 2-income families. So both of you got to be able to get visas that match somehow under the current UK system if you're both going to work here. What about your older children? I mean, we all see children coming home and living with their families in a way that they hadn't done for a couple of generations. So you're over 18, you can't do that now under the new visa system. So I think we've got a set of real problems with the visa system itself. I think the benchmark at £25,000 odd is way too high. So because you want to bring in people at lower skill levels that you're going to train up, it's potential that you often want to bring in the door, as well as accomplished skills. And then when I look at so many of the people who have started businesses here, and I know the fintech side of tech more than I do the others, an awful lot of them came with not very much in their pockets and spent several years working with friends to design their product, get investors, and build up their business. Now, so they've got to find a way to come in. So I think we've got some barriers there. It's not that they can't be tackled, but it does need a very different change in outlook for that to actually happen. And as I say, when you're actually up and running a tech company, you don't just employ a few highly skilled people. You have to be able to employ people all the way down the line to keep your company going. And you need all of those skills to be present, to support your business. So I do think there's going to have to be another look at immigration if we're going to compete. And I think we need to realize we're competing. Other people have very, very good immigration offers, and we're going to be competing with them.
Excellent, great answer as well. Let's move on to kind of digital infrastructure. So Millie Cartwright asks about 5G and whether that should be the main infrastructure focus. John, is something that you've obviously kind of know a lot about and talked about as you, Susan. So it'd be good to get your thoughts on that, or other areas that we really need to invest in to ensure that all this great technology can actually be used.
Well, to start with 5G, it's clearly going to be essential. I get a steady, I'll say it's a trickle of emails from people who have health concerns about the impact of a 5G mast near them. There is a persistent internet meme about this, and I send them the House of Commons library briefing on the lack of dangers of 5G technology. But just people need to be aware that there's that sort of undercurrent, rather like people who were worried about getting vaccinated. There's sort of a political minor backlash going on there in the general population, but I don't think it's going to stop everybody from enthusiastically using 5G products when they're available and the bandwidth is useful for them and so on. So yes, clearly 5G is going to be essential. The follow-up point I make though is this: it's always tempting for governments of any stripe, doesn't matter who's elected at the time, to try and pick the next technology and decide that it's going to be the winner, this technology versus that technology. And in general, politicians are rubbish at doing that. Just terrible. Our track record, doesn't matter who's in charge, is terrible. And I'd far rather have the wisdom of the financial crowd of investors to make those decisions, and for government to try and make sure that it is setting up a system which is as platform or technology neutral, so that it allows the best answers to win out commercially, rather than rewarding the people who've got the best lobbying companies and allowing them to trouser the proceeds, whether or not actually they should have won in the first place.
Okay.
Excellent. Over to
Are you getting anything?
Hey there, I'll give Gary a moment to get himself organised. So I just very quickly, I mean, I'm not a, I think there are two issues, aren't there? I mean, the rollout of digital capacity, I mean, I'm still absolutely staggered at how slow it's been in the UK, and how little serious government effort there has been driving it forward. And clearly our mechanisms generally don't work. So I mean, a rapid overhaul and very fast, and a real commitment, I think, to drive forward capacity. What is quite lucky is, I think many people in the political world and in government have for the first time discovered how bad it is by trying to do Zoom calls around the country. And I think they're in a state of shock. Many of them will have been London-based, it all works down there, but my God, you move outside, people are being cut off every third sentence. So that may have helped somewhat. But there's also the Huawei issue, which I assume is part of, that is embedded somewhere in this question. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I am very worried about the new tensions that exist between one could say Western democracies and China, but it's being strongly exacerbated by the particular attitudes of the United States. China has great ambitions and it's driving them forward across much of Asia and much of the developing world. We've left ourselves in a situation where if we want to move very quickly on 5G, as far as I can understand, and maybe somebody will correct me, it's very hard to do without Huawei being deeply embedded in it. So how we get where we need to and how we balance that against national security considerations, how we even assess those national security considerations, because we seem to have flipped in our attitudes towards China almost over a 3-month period. I think there are a lot of issues around there. And my advice to the industry was just keep up the pressure, because if the government can find a reason to prevaricate and do a review and go and rethink and whatever else, my goodness, it will. And we honestly can't afford it.
Hi guys, I'm back, and Gary is now back on the call. So we're just going to take a break from questions and answers to hear from Gary. Go ahead, Gary.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. I rather feel like Laura Koonsberg on the thing at 5 o'clock being muted. You might not expect a webinar on the tax system to talk about John Maynard Keynes a lot, but he identified many years ago the problem of deficient aggregate demand, i.e. enough people having enough confidence to spend enough money, the paradox of thrift. So assuming we're going to have tax reform on the cards, what do we want from a tax system and how's it going to drive economic growth? Well, the system should minimize distortions. That's not a bad place to start. Be simple to administer and collect. Be perceived to be fair, and the tax authority not going back on assurances they've given. Predictable and stable. Obviously, we're talking about making changes now, but once we've done those, can we leave the system alone? And perhaps I'd say, don't provide tax cuts or subsidies towards behavior that's going to happen anyway. So I could stop now because you're all going to recognize our current tax system. But of course, the first thing is there's going to be a clamour for tax cuts to put the economy on its feet. VAT, corporation tax, maybe income tax. But the Treasury is going to be, for the reasons that John and Susan's already mentioned, going to be pretty damn sceptical, given that the post-COVID deficit is going to be so large, as we've identified. Those tax cuts only make sense if they stimulate the economy. And the evidence for tax cuts, based on what happened with, certainly on VAT, with Alistair Darling back in 2009, is that they didn't achieve very much. They dragged a little bit of expenditure forward, and then you had less expenditure a little bit later. But it wasn't a brilliant evidence of temporary tax cuts do something to get the economy moving quickly. And as Baroness Kramer has already mentioned, we're going to have enough borrowing. Tax cuts will probably make that a worse equation. And if companies are in the fortunate position of being tax-paying, what behavioural change is a corporation tax cut going to do? Wouldn't an investment relief make more sense? But we've talked about tax reform, but for lots over years. But actually, the losers from tax reform generally make more noise than the winners. So generally, you can only do it when the economy is thriving, which clearly is not the case now. So you can buy off the losers by the transition, or only bringing in new people into the new rules, or when there's a crisis. And on the basis that you should never waste a crisis, I think the Treasury is certainly going to look again at corporation tax relief on finance costs. Susan wondered about it being restricted. We actually restricted it back in 2017. Broadly speaking, groups of companies can generally get £2 million worth of tax relief on borrowing. After that, it depends on a proportion of their EBITDA. But debt is so inflexible. Who can cut a business slack with no or fewer customers if the landlord's borrowed from a bank, which has financed itself from the bond markets? I just think he's probably going to have to at least think about it again. And normally, businesses would point to the immediate cost to them of removal of the tax relief. But many businesses will be loss-making. So the relief at best is going to be a future asset. And so the Chancellor could decide this is the time to make that change. And if he wanted to, he could provide an incentive for investment in the right sectors of the economy. And we've already heard a bit about that. I've got a few thoughts of my own. And this would chime with reports of
I think we've lost him there. At least I have. If that's other people's experience.
It appears to have gone on mute again. Could you possibly try unmuting?
Yeah.
You're back again. Great.
Wonderful. I do love Zoom. I think the second area the Chancellor has already hinted at, that's tax and national insurance differential between employment and self-employment. And the conventional wisdom is that the differential reflects the lack of state support for the self-employed. But I mean, that's really changed with support for the self-employed through the tax system, and of course, recent changes to pensions. So I think the first thing he's going to look at is whether class 4 contributions, that's the contributions that the self-employed make, So there's less of a difference between employing someone and engaging a supplier. And the reason that may sound possible is that quite a lot of that is not saving tax to the individual. It's actually borne in the price that's paid by the person engaging the person. But I think he might go further. The Office of Tax Simplification here and the OECD have raised the possibility of companies, particularly in the gig economy, having to provide bulk information on payments made to users of their platforms. Many of those in the gig economy don't pay enough from it, don't earn enough from any particular platform to be liable to tax. But having intermediaries report data may enable HMRC to join the dots and find out who should be tax paying and national insurance paying. However, that data might also enable HMRC to impose an engager's lower rate of employers' NICs. Just a possibility, but I think if we're going to have, as Baroness Cramer called it, abuses of the gig economy, that might be a place where we could go. And of course, if you really want to be radical, Nigel Lawson, many years ago, equalised the rates of of income tax and capital gains tax. I don't think that would be politically attractive, but it does deal with some issues that we have seen in the tax system, which is why it's made it rather complicated. But I think politically that would just be too hard. At which point you're going to say, all I've talked about so far are things like tax rises. How do they get the economy going? And why have I focused on taxes on income and not capital? And both John and Baroness Kramer have been right that actually we may need to be more radical, and maybe we're looking at taxes on wealth or on capital. But I'm not sure whether reforms to those will quickly drive the economy, or whether in the medium and long term they may be necessary. But the simple answer is that income tax, VAT, and national insurance, corporation tax is a fair way behind, are the big earners in terms of tax under the current regime. Which sort of takes you back to where I came in, which is Lord Keynes. Supposing that the government thinks it needs to pump prime investment, not cut it, pump prime investment into the new sectors of the economy, investment in area to encourage investment by the government, not itself directly, probably paying third parties, to encourage others to invest in those areas. So that way around, it's actually spending the tax it raises, not just using it to pay down government debt. And just to take a few random areas, that could be more investment, obviously, in broadband. Could we have a comprehensive system of electronic charging points, possibly with a scrappage system to encourage people to buy electric cars? Would we want grants, VAT reductions to convert underutilised student accommodation in cities into places where generally home-based office workers can stay when they do meet colleagues? Would we want enterprise zones for manufacturing items domestically, where, for strategic reasons, the UK has decided it no longer wants to rely on overseas supply chains? And I'm not just talking about PPE, but I'm talking about other strategic sectors of the economy. So I think if tax goes up, entrepreneurs ought to be looking at it saying, do you know, in the longer term, if that money is spent wisely to make investment and drive activity in the economy, and that feeds through to people who will be spending money in due course on my products, actually not trying to use tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but possibly even use tax rise to stimulate further activity in the economy, may be the way in which we're going in the future. And with that, and I'm conscious of lost time, hand back to Philip.
Awesome, great. So I'm going to kind of race through these questions as best I can, because obviously we only have a few minutes left. But thank you so much for that, Gary. There's a lot of food for thought. I suppose the first one that comes up is from Alan King, and just around EIS and SEIS. And Susan touched on this with the Future Fund, and it was also touched upon with tax breaks. So probably best to ask John this question. Do you think further tax breaks for investment makes sense? Should we be looking to allow the Future Fund to also allow investors to also benefit from EIS and SEIS? What are your kind of thoughts on that area?
Right. Am I now unmuted? I am. I'm afraid I can't reveal what's going to be in the next budget, so goodness knows where the Chancellor's head is on this at the moment. But it's been interesting, hasn't it, that Susan's been talking about levelling the playing field so that the equity gets us more of a share. Gary is also talking about tax simplification and levelling and so on and so forth. If you're going to do those sorts of things, then what it means is that quite a lot of schemes, I've no idea if EIS, for example, will be one of them, but the last budget took a modest lump out of entrepreneurs relief, for example. What it means is that quite a lot of those schemes would probably need to be traded away in favour of other reductions elsewhere as part of the simplification, as part of what Gary was talking about reducing distortions. So I would, if he decides to change the shape of tax, as I was suggesting, and undertake reforms, it's hard to see how he doesn't move in a simplificatory direction. And if he does that, then I think all these schemes will have to pedal harder in order to justify continued existence in exchange for just non-distortive, make the decision based purely on commerce, not on your tax advice.
Right. I'll direct the next question to Susan. It's around investment in innovation from Gary Todd of Familio. So I guess a lot of this money is coming through Innovate UK and UKRI. What's your kind of view on that sort of funding and how the government should kind of be directing that? And I guess kind of coming back to something previously you said and was brought up by John as well, how can we focus the funding on more innovative companies and not be necessarily bailing out companies that just aren't kind of going to be viable no matter what in the kind of economy as it is now?
Thank you. Well, let me just be quick because I know there's so little time. I do think that R&D needs to be a real focus and that you can use tax schemes greatly to advantage it. For example, if you want to give a quick kick to the economy, why not let people claim in advance R&D tax credits, and then you could do a clawback if they didn't in the end use them to invest properly. But you could do things that would kick R&D back up very rapidly now, and I think the government ought to be looking at ways to do it. So I always think the problem in the UK tends to be scale. So any method you can find that scales up the commitment to R&D, we always say, well, look how much more we're doing than last year, but you compare us to essentially our global competitors, our numbers are incredibly weak. So bumping that up is going to be very necessary, and we need to do it aggressively, whatever mechanism we use.
Excellent, thank you. I'll ask the next one to Gary, which is from Claire, and this is around specific kind of cuts to entrepreneurs relief or maybe some kind of small business focused tax cuts. Do you think there's any room for kind of specifically focusing on companies that the government thinks will grow and it will pay off in the long run in terms of increased tax revenue down the line, or is that kind of too distortionary really for your liking?
Are you asking me?
That was for Gary. If you can unmute yourself. Yeah, there we go.
Super. I was going to say, it's not really what I think, it's what the Chancellor thinks. But I think the problem with entrepreneurs relief was it was perceived to be being used by a lot of people who didn't need an incentive. And so if you think you need to incentivize small and growing companies, I think you could do that. But I suspect the deal might be, it's got to be a relief that you've stuck in it for the long haul. It won't be for the 2 years, it'll be for the 4 years or the 6 years or something like that. And then you've got to have some significant things about maybe growth in turnover, growth, investment, whatever. I think it will be a pretty tight scheme if it's going to work. Treasury is very sceptical about let's hand out money now because the economy will grow in the future. You may not like the Treasury's approach, but that's sort of where they start from.
Great. I'll this is kind of similar question, but I think it kind of gets to the nub of it, I suppose. I'll ask John this, which is to do with the balance, I suppose, between tax cuts on the one side and kind of increased spending on the other, and the need to kind of fund things. How do you think? How should the government be thinking about this? How do you think about this? And I'll probably ask that to everyone. If everyone could try and find a kind of unique way of answering, that would be great. Just as we're coming to the end now, so over to you, John.
There we are. So I just pick up on Gary's last point as well. I mean, the old saying that politicians are terrible at picking winners, but losers are really good at picking politicians, is, I'm afraid, absolutely true. And therefore, if you don't move to the sort of world that Gary's describing, you end up with trial by lobbying strength rather than trial by whether or not somebody's doing something that customers want to buy. And I know which sort of a world we all want to live in, and it's I'm afraid, sorry, lobbyists, it's not that one. So in terms of the balance between spending and tax rises, Rishi, as a Tory, will want to avoid increasing the headline rates of tax if he can possibly do so. He will also want to maintain adherence to some sort of fiscal rule, which will probably be roughly in line with the golden rule, i.e. balancing the current budget, current spending, and only borrowing for investment. His difficulty is that we were already right at the top end of what that kind of envelope allowed before the coronavirus crisis struck. So he's got no wriggle room, and he's got a smaller economy to deal with. Then my guess is he's going to have to raise some extra money by, as I said, tax reform. And he will want, if he can possibly avoid it, to avoid outright increases in tax rates themselves. And I think that therefore the difficulty will be in dealing with the public spending sector pressures, because Susan is right. We've had quite a long and extended squeeze on public sector spending. That's going to be difficult to continue. But also, if we're not very, very careful, what will happen is that public sector unions will use political muscle at this stage to say, now's the time for our members to capitalise on public gratitude, and we want a pay rise, and P.S. you're not going to get anything more in terms of the quantity or quality of public services out of that, you're just going to pay us more for it. And that way, that is in economic terms, purely and simply a reduction in total productivity. So I think that is a very, very difficult situation to be in. And that's why I think he's going to have to focus on the tax side, because the spending side is going to be so hard.
Right. Susan, did you want to say a few words? And then I think we should probably have to wrap it up. So over to you, Susan.
Just very quickly, I mean, this is a real lesson, and be careful what you promise. And if you look at the last sort of the pre-COVID budget, it was basically significant promises on public spending, significant promises on infrastructure spending, significant commitments to cut taxes, because we were never going to run into another crisis, were we? I think those political popularity has a real cost attached to it. And at some point now, the Chancellor is going to have to row back on one of the direct or implied commitments that has been made. I honestly don't think you can cut public spending. I just think there just isn't any scope, which is even more of a collapse in the services that we absolutely rely on. I don't think you can do anything on the welfare front. In fact, I think they're going to have to reverse some of the cuts that they've made there. I don't know how long we can carry borrowing. We can get into trouble, and where people are going to be complaining. You might as well make it a complaint about real and fundamental reform that will provide a support for the future. And I would seize that opportunity and use this for an opportunity for real reform.
Right, I'll let Gary just say a final word, and if you could make it extremely brief and perhaps something very radical and provocative based on what Susan's asking for, and then Katrina will just round up. Over to you, Gary.
Well, funnily enough, I think the place where you need to direct the tax cuts would be the low paid. Because if you think about it, if they're going to spend more money, there's more, and not, I'm afraid, the high paid, because one of the reasons we concluded we collect more tax from the rich, which is what political parties would say, is that they're out to make a real difference. Therefore, if you give the tax cut there, they might not spend very much more. Whereas actually the people you'd have to give a tax cut to are people in the street, who there's a lot of them. That's where you do it. But I agree with Susan. I'm not sure cuts are a legitimate thing to expect 2 or 3 years in the climate. If we're going to keep up infrastructure expenditure, and I tend to agree with Susan about current spending, I just don't see the scope for cuts.
And on that note, we are going to move on. Thank you so much to our 3 speakers, John Penrose, Baroness Kramer, and Gary Richards from Mishcon de Reya,